Hi everyone, welcome to the book talk organized by the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. We are really excited to host this event by Dr. Roluahpuia, who is an assistant professor at IIT Roorkee. Dr. Puya has written a very fascinating book which is titled Nationalism in the Vernacular, State, Tribes, and the Politics of Peace in Northeast India, published recently by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Puya has obtained his PhD from TIS, Guwahati. He has won the prestigious Arvind Raghunathan and Sabrila Subramaniam South Asia Visiting Fellowship 2018-2019 at the South Asia Institute at Harvard University, where he completed his postdoctoral fellowship there. Before he moved there, Dr. Puya has also done a bit of a stint at the Center for Study of Developing Societies as a research fellow. And after he returned from Harvard, he also did his postdoc at IIT Guwahati. So Pui has been a prolific academic, very young but very promising scholar who has published extensively in some of the peer-reviewed journal, including ASEAN Ethnicity, Contemporary South Asia, Economic and Political Weekly, Himal South Asia Journal of Borderland Studies, Nations and Nationalism. And what is interesting about Pui's work is that one of his recent piece published in Nation and Nationalism titled Unsettled Autonomy, Ethnicity, Tribes and Subnational Politics in Mizoram, Northeast India has won the prestigious 2020 Ascent Association for Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism oblique Nation and Nationalism Essay Prize, which is awarded every year in honor of uh, the memory of Dominic Jacquin Burdell. So we are extremely privileged and excited to host him. I am grateful that we see many participants from not only from the department, faculty of the department, students, scholars of the department, as well as from outside university. I'm particularly thankful to Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma, who is a colleague in the department, as well as who is now the Dean of the School of Social Science, for having agreed to chair today's book talk. We look forward to this. Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma has published very extensively on the domain of political theory, political philosophy, and he has a series of very distinguished publication, the latest of which is on Gandhi and on nonviolence. Right. So I won't go details into his very illustrious academic career, but I hope that this book talk would be very exciting and enriching in ways that we look at not only nationalism in the vernacular, but also look at the intersection of state, tribes, and the politics of peace through the prism of Mizo nationalism. So I would now hand over the rest of the session to Professor Jyotirmay, who is the chair of this book talk. And the floor is yours, Professor Jyoti.
Thank you so much, Professor Swan, and a very warm welcome to Dr. Puya. I finished reading your book in the wee hours of the morning today, and I just want to share with our audience. I'm sure they'll get much more of the richness and the complexity of the book and its argument from you. But when you start reading it and you come to page 83, there are five lines which absolutely stunningly sum up the core, if there is one, of the book. And I want you to indulge me by allowing me to read it. It says, the idea of the nation means very the idea of the nation means varies across communities and groups who challenge, if not contest, the hegemonic and exclusionary idea of nationhood. The question is not merely about how marginalized communities imagine the nation and contribute to making of the nation, but also about how an alternative imagination of the nation itself is representative of the said communities' political agency. I don't think, you know, um, a book could have had better 5 lines to illustrate what it's about. So I will now show you the book. Here is the book. Read it, buy it, do whatever you want, but engage with it. And I invite Dr. Puya to give his talk this afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Swan, could you kindly upload the slide?
Just a while. I'll do. Uh, just wait. Yes. Just a second. I'll just show you. Okay. I
Yeah,
hope.
okay. Yeah, it is visible. Yeah. Uh, Good evening, and thank you, Professor Swan, for that very generous introduction. I would like to begin by thanking the Department of Political Science, the Hyderabad Central University. It is such an honor to be given this opportunity. Particularly, I feel that I grow up reading many of the works which have come out from the department, and Professor Swan himself has played a very pivotal role in my academic career in terms of shaping and nurturing my thinking, however amateur it may be. And to Professor Sharma for reading the book. And it is such an honor that you have given your time to chair this session. Faculties at the department, friends and everyone who are joining from different places in different parts of the country. So this is the first time I'm doing a book talk, and when Professor Swan intimated me about it, I have been thinking, where should I start, and what aspect of my book should I be talking about? So recently, I had a book podcast that was relatively easy because it is a kind of Q&A session. So there is a lot of liberty and freedom. But when it comes to a book talk, so I was a little worried whether I will be able to convey some of the points and arguments that I intend to make in the book. So anyway, to start with, so the book is on nationalism, as you can see from the title, and it is a subject which I have been working on and writing for some years. And it began as a doctoral project when I sometime when I joined Tata Institute of Social Science in the year 2013. So a personal reflection from my end is that writing this book is something like a journey to me, because it is already in its 10th year when I actually started. Definitely, uh, in this book, I have widened the scope in terms of its theoretical focus on the question of nations and nationalism. And with my multidisciplinary training, I have taken the liberty of using multiple methods throughout my work. But I would say that the work speaks closely to historical and political sociology, blending archival work, photographs, interviews, and observation. Now, in the book, I made three interrelated arguments. One is that try to interrogate the relationship between orality and nationalist politics, and I did this at two levels. One is the first level, which is the creation of vernacular language and idioms, which reframe and reconstruct Mizo-nationalist ideas and the politics of peace. And the second level is the irrepressibility of oral vernacular idioms and practices against states' violent response to Mizo-nationalist movement. Now, connected to this, the idea of exploring the relationship between orality and nationalist politics, I examined this through the vernacularization of politics and nationalist ideas by exploring the divergent ways in which Mizos localize expressions by using terms such as Zalenna, which is freedom, Ramlehnam for territory and nation, and the multiple forms of oral expression in the form of la, songs, such as party la. Party la basically is songs which are composed by individuals or members of political parties, specifically advocating the party ideologies or manifestos. Namhla, national songs, or which can be also loosely translated as patriotic songs, and Rambuaihla, songs of troubled times, to express and articulate their aspirations, dissent, and disenchantment. And finally, the book argues that this vernacularization, this is a process where vernacularization was at work, where political ideas and imaginations, idioms and practices, loss and suffering were articulated in the local that reflected the political agency of the Mizos. Now, so the broader overarching idea is that the process of vernacularization of nationalism in the context of the Mizos was something that was enabled by the participation of the elite as well as ordinary Mizos. Now, coming to the second slide, the context, theories, field, and reflection. Now, the first aspect of this book is that the emergence, which is also one of my contention in the book, is that the emergence of Mizo nationalism predates the emergence and formation of the Mizo National Front, the MNF, which was the main organization that led the armed struggle for that led the armed struggle for independence starting from the year 1966. Now, for instance, I examined the role played by the Mizo Union, which was established in the year 1946, which is also the first political party in Mizo Hills or in Mizoram. And in this, I trace or I explore how Mizo nationalism or the idea of Mizo ethnicity or the idea of Mizo nation was foregrounded by vernacular consciousness, idioms and languages of Ramle, Nam, territory and nation, the groundwork for which was laid by the Mizo Union themselves. Now, as a theoretical inspiration, I have followed several socio-anthropological work that explore vernacular politics, such as Lucius Micheluti's work, The Vernacularization of Democracy, Political Participation in Popular Politics in North India, Ziad Fahmi's work on ordinary Egyptians creating the modern nation through popular culture, Yele Waters' work on performing democracy in Nagaland. I am also heavily inspired by scholarships such as the subaltern studies and many others that have looked at how the nation manifested in the minds and in the consciousness of the marginalized sections. So within nations and nationalism studies, I am also heavily inspired by studies that looks at everyday nationalism that focus on the masses and particularly on the human agency within popular politics and nationalism studies. Now, one of the reasons why I am particularly influenced by the studies on everyday nationalism is their focus on the agency of the ordinary people as the constituents, participants, the makers and consumers of national symbols, rituals, and identities. Now, in the context of the Mizo, I situate this process of vernacularization and manifestations of nationalism uh, within the oral culture of of Mizo society. Now, Mizo society at its heart is an oral culture. And it is known that, until the 19th century, the Mizo communities have no writing systems. And it was only with the coming of the British in the later part of in the late 19th century, and particularly with the intervention of colonial missionaries that targeted them for conversions which activated the writing system. Now, there is also very specific reasons as to why I focus on this issue of orality or oral culture is because it enable us to understand Mizo nationalism within the socio-cultural milieu of Mizo society. Now, when one looks at Mizo society, oral culture in the form of la songs were the predominant means of expression. Now, for example, oral culture, songs were largely, prevalent and predominant modes of expression to periodize history, to express one's anguish, loss, so on and so forth. Now, in many ways, the political parties such as the Mizo Union and the MNF have tapped into this oral culture of Mizo society, and songs were used as a medium to express and spread the ideas of nationalism. One another important aspect to this is that songs can easily transgress borders and boundaries. And for a community that are being divided across national and international boundaries, songs played a pivotal role in terms of acting as the medium of disseminating the ideas of nationalism. Now, between within the 2 decades of armed struggle, particularly during the MNF movement from 1966 to 86, uh, it is very difficult to come up with the exact number of songs that were composed. But as far as my knowledge is concerned, there are more than 200 songs that were composed by the MNF rebels alone during the 20 years of the movement. So coming to a little bit about how I go about doing field work and how I came up with this idea. So I begin my field work with the mindset that I will do this work by uh, locating myself within Aizawl city, which is the capital of Mizoram. Now, when I went to Aizawl city, in a span of 1 to 2 months, I realized that the field narrative is getting saturated, and at the same time, the narrative that is emerging is very very elite and very very urban centric. So this also puts this also raised the question in terms of the scholarship that has been written about the MNF in particular, in a sense that much of the studies tend to be very very urban centric. Now, for example, the very now which is widely read book by Joy Patsuao, Being Mizo, that came out in 2014, is something which is her fieldwork is largely based on Aizawl. Similarly, the retired bureaucrat Sajad Hassan, who did a comparative study of Manipur and Mizoram, also largely did his field work in Aizawl alone. Now, with that realization, I decided to expand my field and make up this uh, come up with this idea that I should travel and move and move all over Mizoram, Tripura, and as well as in Manipur. Now, now in terms of method, I have used multiple methods of data collection, but I just wanted to highlight this something which is very much part of Mizo society, which is TT. Now, TT is a form of informal and unstructured conversation that is very common in Mizo society. Now, people gather in groups, people gather, maybe some families or friends, and when they gather, they engage themselves in something known as TT. Now, so the Mizos are very used to this idea of having TT, which is an informal and unstructured conversation. In that way, doing an interview is something which is very, very suitable when it comes to Mizo society. Of course, it can drag on the interview for, for a very long period. But then it is very helpful for me in terms of trying to streamline, how I wanted to engage with my research participants in the process of my fieldwork. Now, as I've said, I started off in Aizawl and then I branched out to different parts of Mizoram, Tripura, and Manipur. Now, in the course of my meeting with different sections of Mizo society, particularly the former MNF rebels, something that has really struck me is that many of them identified themselves as song composers. And as the interviews and as my fieldwork progressed, I was informed that many of the MNF leaders themselves were composed many songs, not only about the movement but also about gospel hymns, love songs, Christmas songs, so on and so forth. And the another aspect to this is that in my conversation with the former MNF rebels, none of them ever referred to the movement as insurgency or conflict, but the preferred word and the choice remain zalenna, which is freedom. And each one of them, irrespective of their current political positions, they refer to the movement as zalenna swal, freedom struggle. And the struggle was for ramle and namtan, for nation and territory. And political leaders within the MNF narrated how songs were very, very convenient to spread the ideas of Mizo nationalism and easily understood by the people. So through this process of interview, I begin to pick up the idea of Zalenna, Ramle Nam, which which I use it as an analytical frame to explain, what I call the vernacularization of nationalism. Now, throughout, I have done mostly in-depth interviews with more than 770 individuals, and I have also used field notes, photographs, observations, along with analysis of archival materials. Can, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So the next two to three slides will be largely touching upon the chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book, where I try to address what I call the tribal question in India. Now, in the mainstream literature, the tribal question is mostly framed between two opposing positions, which is the integrationist and the isolationist, or widely known as the Gurye-Elwin debate. Now, it is known that G.S. Gurye advocated for the gradual assimilation of tribes within the Hindu fold, while the anthropologist Vera Irwin saw such efforts as a direct threat to the survival of tribes, and hence he pleaded for the isolation of tribes. In many ways, this debate has occupied center stage within both academia and policy concerning tribes, particularly during the years between 1920 and 1950, that is up to the Constituent Assembly debates. Now, by and large, I contend that this debate of integration and isolation reflects the uh, post-colonial state anxiety and insecurity over borders and the tension between the cultural insider and the outsider. And in many ways, integration of tribes, even till today, is seen or is projected as a panacea for tribal problems in India. Now, contrary to this position, and one of the problem about this integration and isolationist debate is also that it totally silenced the position of the tribes themselves, which is an issue that historians like Bangya Bukia have highlighted and engaged in depth in his work. Now, to me, one of the most important question when it comes to addressing or engaging with the tribal question in India is the issue of autonomy, and this takes place at two levels. One is movements that aspire for internal autonomy within the Constitution of India in the form of statehood or such as constitutional provisions such as the Sixth Schedule, to total independence, basically movements that aspire for independence, as in the case of the Nagas and the Mizos in Northeast India. Now, as with the Mizos, the Mizo Union, the Mizo Union was leading the movement, was the forerunner when it comes to demand for inclusion. Now, there is a specific reason as to why I am using inclusion in place of integration. Because when we use the term integration, there are two things which there are two ways in which how I look at integration. One is it is a very domineering, it has a very domineering tendency, and second, it is very very hegemonic. So there is a problem that I have with this whole idea and concept of integration. So I prefer the term using inclusion. So in the case of the Mizo Union was a party which was led by the commoners, the majority commoners, emerged as a forerunner in demanding inclusion with terms laid down by them. Now, the Mizo Union demanded two things broadly. One is the territorial unification of Mizo inhabited areas that will encompass the southern Manipur, parts of Tripura, parts of Assam, as well as today's Mizoram. And the another demand that they made was the replacement or the renaming of Lushai into Mizo. Now, the second demand was accepted, whereas the first, remained something which is unfinished or unrealized. Its leaders, such as Cho Chunga, Arvan Loma, Cho Sapronga, and HK Boyswaga, among others, hail from the non-Lusay clans who were also the early educated class. Now, coming to uh, coming to Mizo Hills or Mizoram in specific, in many times there is an assumption that tribes does not engage or participate in the national movements, And sometimes, it is also common to see and view tribes as apolitical subjects. But then, as with communities like the Mizos, the last 2 decades of colonial rule in Lusai Hills basically was the is today's Mizoram, were marked by resistance and confrontation between Mizo commoners and the British. Now, this confrontation between the Mizo commoners and the British takes place at multiple levels. One is the Mizos challenged the colonial policy of exclusion on the ground that it denied them political rights and participation. Now, Lusai Hills, along with many other tribal areas in India during colonial period, were put under something known as the indirect rule. Now, the Mizos challenged this colonial policy of exclusion. And second is that the MNF, the Mizo Union, confronted the colonial state in a sense that they started demanding the abolition of chieftainship. That also resulted into into the growing into something known what I call the anti-British sentiment among the Mizo commoners. And several efforts were made by Mizos at the level of political, at the level of individuals, at the level of groups. One among them was Telela and his friends, who were the first victims because they were arrested due to their demand for political representation. Now, the Mizo Union was a party that was pro-integrationist, and they were largely pro-integrationist because of the promise of democratic rule under Indian Union. Now, for instance, several slogans that were popular during the period reflect this. Uh, so as you can see, what do we want? To join Indian Union. Why? To abolish the chiefs. Now, on the right side of the image also, we see, some of the slogans that were raised by the Mizo Union members and supporters. Mizo Union for our nation. Have we got freedom? No, we have not. What did we get? Serf rule. Serf rule, let it be gone. Chiefs rule, let it be gone. Superintendent Peter, let him be gone. What should we do if he is not gone? We will disobey his orders. Now, I must add that during colonial period, Mizo society is a society which is largely divided into two classes. One is the chief class, and the other are the commoners. So the chief enjoy several privileges as compared to the commoners. But then during colonial period, what we see is that the role of the chiefs of the Mizo chiefs were transformed in such a way that they were nothing more than decentralized despots, a term which is used by Mahmud Mamdani. So basically, the role of the chiefs during colonial period was limited to taxation, and many of the traditional roles that they played, such as hunting and many others, were no longer permissible. And alongside this, the British also awarded many chief titles to individuals not belonging to the chief clan. Now, in many ways, for the vast majority of the Mizos, the chiefs were becoming a burden under the colonial rule. So this is one of the reasons why there was a lot of anti-chieftainship sentiment at the dawn of India's independence. At the same time, a political party of the chiefs, which was also backed by the British or by the colonial state, named the United Mizo Freedom Organization, emerged, raising the demand for integration of Mizoram or Lusai Hills with Burma. So during the period 1946 to 1950, several non-cooperation movements were launched against the British. And this also means challenging the institution of chieftainship. Now, since the British were in support of the chiefs, so the Mizo Union ended up fighting two battles, two enemies, one the British and the other the chiefs. At the same time, we also see a continual attempt by the British to suppress and undermine any form of protest led by the Mizo Union. So, for example, the Mizo Union defied the order of the chiefs. They attacked their houses. They were engaged in stone pelting and also collective protest in the form of rallies. But at the same time, it was not that the colonial state did not do anything. There were several efforts to undermine any kind of political mobilization by the Mizos themselves. Professor Swan, can you just show the next slide, please?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So these were some of the orders that were issued by the British, by the political superintendent who were based in Mizoram. Now let me just read the first one and the third one. Mizo Union is restricted from collecting or receiving any form of donation The donation may be of any kind, inclusive of membership, your contribution or collection or whatever name it carries. It does not matter. Mizo Union is restricted from any kind of collection or donation. Any individual who is involved in collecting financial donation for Mizo Union would be considered as a liar and should be punished as such. Now let me go to the third one. Mizo Union is an illegitimate, self-appointed organization of people who are habituated of talking about governance and society in public. It does not have any legitimate basis of authority and representation. It is only the conference members who have sole authority to proclaim it as being representative of the people. Any other individual or parties who consider themselves as representing the people are at best deceiving themselves. And in the worst case, they are like fascists, ascribing to Hitler's fascist rule. Fascist governments question democratic governance and challenge them by granting themselves de facto rule. It is deplorable when it succeeds and a matter of shame if it fails. I inform you and your union to remember this. Can you just go back the previous slide? Yes. So I'm not going to, going to explain the the significance of the orders that were issued by the British. Now, political contestations between the Mizo Union and the AMFO, the chief groups, continue to grow deep. And in the process, it gave birth to a culture of what is now known as party la, songs by political parties. At the same time, the rise of Mizo Union in Mizo society is very significant in a sense that it resulted into a socio-political transformation of the commoners' rise to power, both socially and politically. Now, this also relates, to what many other scholars, such as Christopher Jaffelot, have written about the rise of the plebeians. In Mizo society, we have seen that kind of rise at the dawn of India's independence. Let me just have water, please. Just give me a second.
Just wait.
I think you're both on silent mode.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm audible now.
Yes, yes, you are. Please continue.
So the rivalry between the Mizo Union and the United Mizo Freedom Organization gave birth to a new kind of a new culture known as the Party La. Now, the Party La acted as an essential medium to disseminate party ideologies and manifestos, and it created very two significant impact. One is two-party La. Democratic politics get entrance where the elites and the commoners actively participate in constructing and shaping the political discourse. Second is the link between democracy and politics was made through the oral, making political discourse part of the everyday life of the people. Yes. Now, to just briefly discuss some of the songs that were composed. For example, Pukhotin Kuma, they are the leaders of the Mizo Union. Puksa Bronga, Pudeng Trauma, Putan Lira, Pulal Boya, Puvan Trauma. Union never errs in its judgment. Even the chieftains are such dimwits, not knowing when to give in yet. The Union army will surely march on. Like the southern storm, they'll sweep the hills. Let all the despotic chieftains surrender, for the nation council to emerge, led by the Almighty God to prosper and to spread peace among all the tribes. And for all the people of the Zoland, let's pray for the blessings of the Almighty, for the day whence elites and commoners alike to rejoice in celebration shall come. Now, from that songs, one can capture the imagination of freedom from the yoke of the chiefs and the British, right? Now, in this song, I'm just going to read two songs, the middle one and the last one. True Unions. This is a song by the Mizo, the United Mizo Freedom Organization, AMFO. True unions, but not the same. Our union for Mizoram, your union to please the Vai. The Vai basically the outsiders. Now, on the contrary, Mizo Union responded by singing the song, submit they have the union leaders, the majority's opinion to the subcommittee, even about the cookie and the reserve outside. Everything's addressed, nothing missed out. Foxes among sheep they are, those who want to join Burma, failing in their independent attempt, now preaching Pakistan. So the political consciousness and mobilization in the form of party Hla earmarked a new beginning in Mizo politics, the impact of which was seen in a way that continued to shape the political contours of the Mizos. Now, for example, even till today, Hla in many ways continue to shape Mizo political culture. And some of us who continue to follow what is happening in Mizo society, in Mizo politics, or the larger geopolitics in Northeast India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. Even yesterday, we had, if some of us know the solidarity rally that was organized in across Mizoram yesterday, we see the relevance of songs in terms of mobilizing the public, and how the people sing different kinds of kla in unison during the entire period of the rally. Next slide. Now I'm moving. I think I have 10 more minutes.
Yes, yes, yes. Please go ahead.
So now coming to the MNF. So between 1959 and 1961, the Mizo Hills and their adjoining areas were hit by a massive famine known as Mautam. Now, Mautam is a naturally occurring famine that is caused by flowering of a specific type of bamboo, which is found in which is found in largely in Southeast Asia. So this bamboo flowers periodically with a cycle of 50 years, and the bamboo fruits, which are very rich in proteins, stimulate an abnormal rise in rat population. Now, in Mizo Hills, the Mizo Hills were struck by the Mautam in 1959, and several organizations emerged to tackle and respond to the famine. The most renowned one is the Mizo National Famine Front. Now, some of the leaders of the Mizo National Famine Front are on the right, that you can see in the image. Laldenga was one of the forerunner of MNFF. Now, the impact of the famine was very, very severe, with massive loss of food grains that led to mass starvation and the deaths of many across the hills. Now, it was estimated that at least some more than 1,000 Mizos, died during the famine. And for a population that was barely a lakh, which crossed barely a lakh, 1 lakh during 1960s, the death of thousands Mizos was felt very, very strongly. By 1961, the famine was more or less over, and as normal life began to resume, Mizo politics underwent a tectonic shift. One is that the Mizo National Famine Front uh, rename or reinvent themselves as a political party by dropping the word famine. So they retain Mizo. The new political party was named as Mizo National Front, and there were many political shift was happening in Mizo Hills for three main reasons. One is that Mizo political realized that the powers that were conferred to the district councils under the sixth schedule of the Indian constitution failed to protect and safeguard their political interests. And with the MNF and the Mizo Union emerging as the main political rivals in Mizoram, it reignited debates about the political status of the Mizos, basically statehood versus independence. So statehood was something which was demanded by the Mizo Union, and independence by the Mizo National Front. So when the MNF reinvent themselves as a political party in 1961, they make their intentions very clear, which is that they will demand the highest form of self-determination, which they call Zalen Nasangber, highest form of self-determination. Now, the experience of famine also reinforced two feelings among the Mizos. One is that there was a feeling of unwantedness, a feeling of being rejected, and a feeling of betrayal by the Assam and the Indian government. And the other is that it reinforced the Mizo views of self-reliance and self-determination. Uh, if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. Now, in 1963 and between the period 1961 to 1965, political contestations between the Mizo Union and the MNF took place in terms of their political demands. Now, the Mizo Union has been always pro-integration. and the MNF, make their demands very, very clear, which is independence. Now, for example, a line in the memorandum of Mizo Union reads as, during the constitution making stage, the Mizo people were in a great dilemma. A dilemma of a keen desire to link up their political life with Assam on the one hand, and of fear of being economically submerged on the other. Ultimately, the situation could be reconciled within the framework of the present autonomous existence envisaged under the sixth schedule. To remain in or to be part of Assam was considered as an economic advantage, and the autonomous existence was also of our choosing as the best option for our people.
I think there's some technical issue. I think he's got frozen. Frame has got frozen. Professor Swan, could you call him on the phone and say that, Dr. Puya, can you hear
Yes,
me?
yes, yes, I can hear you, sir.
Your frame got frozen for a minute or so. So could
Okay,
you just go back about 5 sentences back and
okay,
start
sure, sure, sure. Yeah,
again,
yeah,
please?
yes,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you so much. So, Uh, the contested political visions between the Mizo Union and the MNF begin to, grow subsequently after the end of the famine. Now, the Mizo Union, who were very pro-integration, is basically who were, their political desire was to integrate Mizo or in Mizoram into the Indian Union. So they also begin to demand a separate statehood from Assam or separate statehood for Mizos. Now, on the contrary, the MNF demanded independence, and they expressed this in a memorandum that was submitted to the government of India. The Mizo Union memorandum was submitted in 1963, and the MNF memorandum was submitted in the year 1965. Now, uh, as you can see from the memorandum, in the second paragraph of the slide, the Mizo Union leaders note that while there is no longer any desire to be a part of Assam, there is still that sincere desire in the hearts of the Mizo people to feel Indian, but which they cannot feel in the present circumstance. And it is in this view of the situation that the memorandum is presented, laying bare the need for the creation of a separate state for the Mizo people to be named Mizoram State. Now, the MNF, on the other hand, were quite outspoken, or they were quite vocal about their demand for independence. Their memorandum reads as, it seeks to represent the case of the Mizo people for freedom and independence, for the right of territorial unity and solidarity, and for the realization of which a fervent appeal is submitted to the government of India. Professor Swan, if we can go to the next slide. Now, around this time, that was basically in the 1960s and the early in the early 1960s in particular, a new genre of songs known as namhla began to took over the political discourse, with many of them harking upon the larger issue of independence. Now, within Mizo society, several song composers such as Roorkee and Roluahpuia began to be widely popular, and the songs which are composed by Roorkee are worthy of attention, as they were the ones that captured the imagination of the Mizos. Now, for example, his song in Mizo, which is known as Harla Harla, which is Awake Awake, was very, very popular, and it has stirred the nationalist imagination, particularly among the youth. The song goes as, awake Zoram, lest you should be late. Make haste, the time shall pass. Arise, get upon your feet. Hark, hark, the chime of freedom bell. Rise up and shine, make no delay. Let this be let this our one endeavor be, to stand firm neath our nation's banner, in robes of loyalty and courage array. His song, the song Soon, this song by Rokunga and many other songs that he composed began widely popular, arousing the feelings of nationalism. And it had a major influence and spread throughout the length and breadth of the areas where Mizos live. Rokunga's song Ro Min Rail Sa Kangtse, Bido Our Counselor, was chosen as the Mizo national anthem by the MNF. A significant point here is that Rokunga, despite the kind of popularity he have, was never joined the MNF movement. However, what uh, the case of individuals like Rokunga, tells us is that Mizo nationalism was not only something which the MNF construct. It does not only belong to the MNF. It also belonged to the non-MNF members. It also belonged to the ordinary Mizos. Now, many of his other songs, as you can see here, I'm not going to read out anymore, uh, continue to be sung, and they continue to remain quite popular even till today. So Namla acted as a catalyst for mass mobilization, and due to their oral form, they successfully instilled a strong sense of national consciousness. And the Mizo rebels themselves composed diverse array of Namla, from battalion songs to songs that call for unity, sacrifice, and struggles. Now, during this time, the response of the Indian state was to conducting massive counter-insurgency campaigns. And as a response to that, a new genre of law known as Rambuaila emerged. There is a context to as to why Rambuaila emerged. One is there was mass censorship. No media, no print materials, diaries, any form of writings, any form of writings were not allowed, particularly during the early years of the movement. Uh, in terms of media, it was only All India Radio that was allowed to operate. Second is that the counterinsurgency was very, very brutal and very, very harsh. For example, village groupings were implemented from 1967 to 1979. So village grouping basically is a form of what we call camps or internment. Sometimes even people call it concentration camps. So the group village, or the case of the Mizos, may not necessarily be something may not necessarily resemble concentration camps, but it in many ways was uh, it in many ways was fulfilling, or it in many ways makes the population legible for the state. So to group so from 1967 to 1970, 4 or 5 phases of groupings was conducted, and a total of 87% of the entire Mizoram population was covered under the grouping scheme. Now this has entirely shattered the economy, the social life of the people. The traditional customs and normal life were also heavily disrupted due to this. I'll just take another 5 minutes and I think I can wind up. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so a discourse about one of the most dominant discourse about Mizoram today is the idea of successful counterinsurgency. And this idea of successful counterinsurgency becomes so dominant in such a way that it has uh, it 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 resulted into the silencing and erasure of the memories of the violent past. Professor Swan, can we go to the next slide? So, for example, when I went and do some archival work, the only archival materials that were available, it is located in IDSA in Delhi. So in the annual Ministry of Defense report, what I have seen is that it is only about how village groupings were helping the Mizo local population. But however, the experience of grouping was something which was very, very harsh and brutal. But even till today, in Mizoram, we don't have any memorial sites that commemorate the violent history. There are no archival records of it in the Mizoram State Archives, nor there is anything which is being preserved or which is being used as a document, and which is being kept in Mizoram State Museum. And there is no recognition and acknowledgement of aerial bombings and the internments through groupings. Now, it was in this context that the Mizo society, fall back to the oral to express their experience of counterinsurgency. And Rambuaila is very, very pertinent in a sense that it tells us, what counterinsurgency does to people. So, in most of the songs, in most of the Rambuaila, what remained very, very central is the village, largely due to the village grouping that was conducted from the year 1967 to 1970. Can we go to the next slide? So, by and large, Mizo nationalism defies state repression, with Rambuaila offering narratives of people's experience of counterinsurgency. Rambuaila tells the story of human consequence of lives under violence, unraveling the wholesale violence and the regime of terror, the dislocation and disruption, the loss and longings, and how the Mizos understand their condition and speak in their own terms. Last slide. So the book broadly looks at, it examines law in relation to Mizo nationalism. It interrogates this within the framework of vernacular nationalism and locates the use of law within Mizo oral culture. It was in Hla that Mizos articulated their aspirations, Party Hla, Nam Hla, and recorded their experience, Ramboy Hla. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Puya. I now invite Professor Swan to formally respond to the book with comments and his views on the book. Professor Swan.
Okay, Professor Jyoti, thank you. And let me once again congratulate Puya for this very excellent book, as well as for his excellent presentation today, which captures some of the nuance and complexities at play that he flays out so competently. I must also commend him for having published a book at the highest level at a very young age, which in effect should inspire many generation of scholars, not only from Mizoram and Manipur, but also from other parts of Northeast India and India at large. So that's something which is commendable and which is inspiring to know that someone who is very committed and who has excelled in his professional vocation at a very young age. I like the way in which this book, in effect, traverse a very interesting terrain which seldom comes to light in some of the earlier works that Puya mentions. In passing, one is Zoe Pachuau's very authoritative work on Mizo identity as well as Mizo nationalism, and Sajjad Hassan's very authoritative work which compares the question of legitimacy or identity crisis by looking at Manipur and Mizoram. And to the extent that Puya has succeeded in telling us some of the untold stories from bottom up, as it were, by unraveling the importance of vernacular idioms, of prose, of poetry, of songs, and reframing in ways which, in effect, give us an alternative understanding of how nationalist discourse play out at the intersection of the national project and regional, elite project is something which strikes me and which is very, very important and potent to it possibilities of rethinking at our conventional wisdom about nationalism essentially as urban centric or as elite construction. And to the extent that Puya, multi-methods and multi-sited excavation of some of these untold stories or oral sources, to my mind, is a very important contribution. Having said that, I think one of the things that, in fact, is important is the fact that the way in which this Namla, that is national song, Rambhoila, or songs of trouble, times of trouble, or even Party La, the songs about party or the party centric songs composed in effect constitute a site of the site which cannot be somehow suppressed, or the irrepressibility of vernacular source of nationalism, to my mind, is a very interesting insight which in effect illuminate in a new way the importance of vernacular source as a site of sustaining as well as giving popular cover to nationalist framing, not only in the context of Mizoram, but also in Latin America or in other parts of the world. And to my mind, this act of what Puya calls it as survivance, of positing, la, or of these vernacular idioms through the instrumentalities of songs, vernacular songs, as a site of survivance of nationalism, of national discourse, is very, very interesting. And this is precisely where I think it begs us the question of even the authors or the source of such law as an instrument of survivance. And this is precisely where it would be useful if, for example, for the educative value of the audience and participants of this book talk, if we could set some more light on the context and background of the composer of this la, as it were, party la or Ramboy la, as it were, who are the composer of these songs and how do these songs circulate in popular perception as well as popular imagination, and how they capture by in ways which transform popular support of Mizo nationalism, which in effect was sought to be delegitimized as insurgency or as what he called insurrectionist activities, which both the colonial as well as the post-colonial state seeks to delegitimize, right? So I think that that is one important thing that I think should help us in understanding better how nationalism or vernacular nationalism navigate in ways which give popular cover as well as popular nature, and which in effect becomes irrepressible side of navigating particular trajectory in ways which not only help in giving popular cover and broadening the scope and power and appeal of nationalism, but also in competently competing with the overarching hegemonic dominant nationalist discourse. That's
I think we have lost Professor Swan, but we'll wait for him to reappear. These are the perils of this online mode. Ah, you're back. You're on the mute.
okay. I'm really sorry. I just somehow
No,
uh,
no, no. We
uh,
waited for you patiently. Don't
oh,
worry.
sorry, Jyoti, I'll take a bit more time. Okay, the
Yeah, yeah.
second point, I think, which come out very powerfully across the book is the important ways in which the politics of peace is sought to be interrogated and questioned in ways which capture the internal dynamics by foregrounding the important roles of complex interests of actors, which in fact are germane to the politics of peace from the very outset since around the 1970s, when you have this important Calcutta Convention, which for the first time foreground the shift in political discourse of MNF, which in effect become more receptive to the idea of accepting political solution within the framework of India's constitution. And this is precisely the time in which you have the formation of the People's Conference, the PC, led by the former, high-ranking Mizo Brigadier T. Tenpong Asilo, and which in effect gave birth to very interesting terms, which in effect I heard for the first time, very frankly, Beng Varna and Beng Venna, which we try to capture as one of the important ways in which we ought to think about the complex ways in which different interests or different actors in effect navigate the politics of peace within Mizo. And this is also important because this also open up important sides of the problematic role of local informants in fomenting trouble as well as strife within as well as across parties. And I would be keen to hear from Pui how these problematics of peace in effect reframe or restates the multi-layered nature of peace negotiation, and in ways which also contribute in some ways to the compromising position that the MNF have from Zalianna, that is independence, to one which in effect got negotiated within the framework of India's constitution. And I think this is important precisely because you have interesting dynamics unravel from the 1970s when some of these factions within the MNF, led by Chwaka and others, persist with the idea of Zalianna, uncompromised, nature of MNF stated position on Zalianna, and which in effect also led or open up new side of sabotaging, the MNF movement itself, because the Indian state used it as a very useful instrument in breaking the ranks of the Mizo. And that is precisely where I think other comparative studies on conflict would point to the powerful role of spoilers, in case of ethnic fractionalization. And that is where I think Pui's attempt to capture this complex, layered nature of peace negotiation itself, having implication on a conventional understanding for example, projecting Mizo peace accord as a very definitive model of peace, in effect, is not quite the case, because it has to struggle with inherent, contradiction as well as contestation within as well as across different political stakeholders within the MNF as well as across political formation in the Mizo Hills. And I think if we could set some of this slide for people who are not very familiar with this complex terrain of politics of peace, would be very useful. And I think in closing, I must again commend Pui for this very, very excellent and very interesting work. And if Pui could also, in effect, show some light on the methods that he used, given that this is for the first time that a very definitive book of this nature is informed by path-breaking field research, not only in Mizoram but in Manipur and in Tripura, is very distinctive. And to what extent does he think that the sample of his interviewers or of his interviewees actually in effect play important role in lending substance and richness to the theory that alternative framework that he comes up with. And with this, let me again thank Pui and Professor Sharma for this time, and thank you. If he wants to respond, he may. So.
Yeah, Dr. Poe, please take 10 minutes to respond,
Okay,
15.
I think 10
What's
minutes is
good?
too.
10 minutes is good? Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, thank you, Professor Swan, for that very insightful comments. And also the questions I think are very, very significant and central to central to the book. Now, I'll start with the third question, which is the methods that I use. One is that uh, when I started my field work in ISO, there were in 3 months' time, like I said, in during my presentation, and looking back now, there was a realization in me that the field was constructed in the process. My field or the field work, the process of doing field work was something which is always something which I constructed while doing my study. So, for example, why I say this is that when I uh, started my interview in ISO, it began, realized that the narratives that I'm getting is very, very saturated. And as you know, since many of the MNF, the former rebel leaders, are already, part and parcel of the state today, they are very, very, particular in terms of what kind of narratives they want to present. And then secondly, in many ways, in the larger Mizo political discourse, we have a lot of vernacular writings that have come out, particularly after the 2000s. A kind of, it can be in the form of autobiography, it can be in the form of writings about encounters and experience. Now, uh, what I have seen from these writings is also that the narrative of MNF movement is something which is very very elite centered, which is very very isocentric. People who can write, people who can people who get platforms are the one who are controlling the narratives. And in many ways, the narratives of or the contestations within the movement itself was something that did not really come up. So in the process of doing field work, in the process of doing my field, in the process of writing this, in the process of doing field work, I realized that the field to me was something which was always constructed in the process. So there was a social construction of the field when I was doing my field work. And whether or not the field is supposed to have a boundaries is also something that I have been that I have been grappling with. Now, for example, in a typical socio-anthropological kind of work, it always started with a village, for example. There is, a sense that, the field is to be done in, very bounded sites. But now, as for me, if I wanted to really, go into the depth of, the MNF movement or try to understand narratives that are being submerged or suppressed, then I cannot be bounded by any kind of, territorial boundaries. So, for example, during my time in Harvard University, I get the chance to speak to many Misos who are living in US. Now, even in the United States, also I have learned, I have heard about how people experience the movements. So throughout this 10 years, throughout the 10 years, I think that my field is something which is always which is always under construction. So the field is something which is very bounded, is something which I have I am grappling with. And second is that from the narratives of from the narratives of my research participants, one thing that is very clear is that even till today they refuse to be labeled as insurgents. Now, for example, as late as 2019, the current chief minister of Mizoram, Puzoram Thanga, in one of his interview with a news with a newspaper based in the Northeast, have categorically said to the news reporter that we were not insurgents, we were freedom fighters. Now, but strangely, in academic discourse, we continue to use terms and concepts like insurgency. Even in Mizoram, in many of the curriculums that we have, we continue to retain the term insurgency when the people themselves are refusing to be labeled and tagged as insurgents. So in that way, I think to appreciate and acknowledge of the political agency of my research participants, then I begin to develop and engage with the idea of Zalenna, Ramle, Nam, so on and so forth. Now, coming to the politics of peace, so the contention that I make, I think it is very important. The points that you have raised in terms of how the Indian state have mastered factionalism along ethnic lines, factionalism along ideological lines, factionalism within the MNF, and even beyond the MNF. Now, many a times, many a times my reading of peace efforts in the Northeast and beyond is that. Uh, we tend to see peace as a kind of benevolent act, or peace as an initiative to bring about order, peace as an attempt to bring back normalcy. So this in many ways legitimize a lot of cosmetic change, but it totally erase and erode the possibility of talking about, for example, justice. Now, in Mizoram, despite the fact that there is this very celebratory discourse of Mizoram as the most successful peace state, there is still even a reluctance to talk about the question of justice, even in today's Mizoram. Justice against the brutal actions and violence that were being perpetuated upon the civilians. And the other aspect is that from the 1970s onwards, the MNF movement was impacted by the larger geopolitical change that was happening in South and Southeast Asia. Now, for example, the emergence of Bangladesh as an independent state has deeply affected the MNF. It deprived them of their military sanctuary in East Pakistan, particularly in Chittagong Hills Tract. The other is that the other point I think which is important, and which I have called, which I have referred, which I have named in my book, is what I call the politics for peace. Now, uh, in the context of Mizoram, what has happened is that the change of guards in Delhi, when it was a Congress government and then when it was the JP government post the emergency period, has really affected the MNF leadership, has really affected the MNF organization. Now, for example, you briefly mentioned about Calcutta Convention, and Calcutta Convention was one of the first sincere efforts by the government of India and MNF to arrive at an amicable solution within the framework of the Indian Constitution. But and it subsequently resulted into what is known as it subsequently resulted into the first ceasefire agreement that was signed between the MNF and the government of India. Now that dialogue, which has which has gone very far, was sabotaged when the Janata Party came into power in, I think, 1977 or 77 or 78, after the emergency. So in that way, the chains of guard in New Delhi, affected local politics, affected the politics of peace. So it resulted into fratricidal killings among political parties, particularly between the MNF and the People's Conference. And in many ways, the Indian state was also quite well aware of the new political events that were taking place in the later part of the 1970s. So uh, I think it is important to go beyond, when talking about peace, I think it is important to go beyond this obsession of restoring law and order, restoring normalcy, bringing back order in this troubled periphery. So, true things that are pertinent is the interest of the political parties themselves in sustaining the conflict, or the interest of the political parties themselves in bringing rival parties into dialogue. And second, an aspect which is rarely being talked and discussed is the question of justice. So, by and large, what we have is that political concession, or what Sanjeev Barrow has called cosmetic federalism. So, in this kind of political arrangement, does not have any scope for justice and any scope for justice, any scope for reconciliation. And I'm afraid that if we continue with this kind of model, and voices, experience of marginality, experience of violence will continue to be suppressed. Now, coming to the first, who are the composers? Uh, well, the composers comes from a very the composers, the song composers come from very, very diverse backgrounds. And like I said, many of the composers themselves were never part of the movement. But what is important about, and what is important, and to me, what makes it significant is also that many of the song composers, some of them whom I met, were illiterate, were uneducated. But then, despite that, they contributed and shaped the discourse of Mizo nationalism. So the other part is that, it was also something which was very, very rural. Now, Mizoram in the 1950s and 60s was very, very agrarian in nature. It was largely a rural society. And for the MNF leaders, with the kind of resources, with the kind of minimum resources they have, it was impossible for them to disseminate their ideas of nationalism using, for example, say, print materials. So it becomes easy for them to fall back on the oral. And the oral, being part and parcel of Mizo society, was easily understood and receptible to all. And how it spread, and what are the ways in which this different kind of class spread, I think this has to do with Mizo society. Now, in Mizo society, different forms of group singing are very, very common. Now, for example, singing like Lengkhom Zai, or different kind of singing traditions which were being practiced, enabled this kind of oral, this the different forms of Zai, what Mizos call Zai, groups, singing in group, enabled the spread and diffusion of these songs across borders and boundaries. So I hope I was able to respond.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, boy, fine. Yeah.
Thank you for this response. Now I invite questions. Um, Please raise your hand or put the raised hand icon on your little square or rectangle, whatever it is, and ask a question. You can also write a question in the comments section. So, is there a question? Aman Bhushan, please ask. Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, Aman.
Uh, Thank you, sir, for your wonderful talk. Uh, My question is the vernacularization of modernist political values, which we you are talking, like democracy, nationalism, social justice, uh, secularism, where these values get imprinted into the psyche of common people. There is always the role of social players, social forces uh, are in play here. But can this vernacularization take place where there is absence of social struggle and political elites take the center stage and implement this process? What I have in my mind is Lalu Prasad Yadav's rule in Bihar in 90s and early 2000. So can this vernacularization take place in the absence of the social? Thank you.
Uh, Dr. Puya, would you like to collect a few questions or answer them one by one? Entirely up to you.
Maybe I would like to collect if there are more questions, maybe
Okay,
one or two more
okay,
questions.
okay. Um, Deepak Kumar, please go ahead with your question. Deepak says, long question. Would you like, Deepak, would you like to ask the question or should I read it? Deepak Kumar.
Actually, hello, sir. Actually, internet connection is not good. That's why I typed.
Yeah, I can hear you clearly. So go ahead quickly with your question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Puya, for this wonderful talk and your book, which I really enjoyed reading. I wanted to ask one question. Which I couldn't find in your book. That is the intellectual inspiration or intellectual source in the very early phase of the Mizo nationalism, because something like let's say a national movement in Assam or Mizo soldiers fighting in Europe, just like Naga Hills or something else, because uh, the source of Naga soldiers when went to Europe to fight during the World War, they get this idea of nationalism, and when they came back to their home, they developed this idea, and the Naga nationalism started. So I was
Okay.
wondering if you could
Right.
tell
Yeah.
something about the.
Yeah. Yeah. We got that.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
thank you,
Another
thank you.
question quickly. Um, is there any other question, please? Don't see a question at the moment. Okay, Dr. Priya, please, if you could begin by answering these two,
Okay,
and then
yes,
I'm
sure.
sure there'll be other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Aman and Deepak, for that question. I'll just briefly respond to Aman first. Well, I am not very well versed, to give a direct response to what you ask, because it will require for me to read and understand the context from which you're asking me that question. But from my work and from my experience is that I uh, that the sentence or the term that you use, absence of social struggle. So I don't think absence of social struggle is a possibility at all. That is, because for example, even in the Mizo case, what we have seen is that it is projected as a case of successful counterinsurgency, and there is no records about how people experience the violent counterinsurgency. But then through songs, when we started digging when we started looking at how people express themselves through songs, then we see that the kind of disenchantment, the kind of sufferings that people experience. So I don't know, because I cannot say very confidently, because I am not very well versed with politics in Bihar. But the absence of social struggles, I think I don't think that any society will be devoid of socio-political struggles. It may be that it is submerged. It may be that it is totally silenced. But if we dig into the depth of things, I think we might be we can find, definitely I think there is always a possibility of struggles, irrespective of how strong the dominant forces are. The question by Deepak, I think this is a very pertinent point, and the exposure, not only the Nagas, even the Mizos and the Kukis also, the exposures that they have in Europe through, through the through the world wars, for example, thus shape a new kind of outlook. Uh, Definitely, it does play a lot of a significant role, but then it was not only because they go to France, or they go to different parts of the world, that they come back with nationalist ideas. So in many ways, what I intend to foreground through this, without what I intend to foreground through this, is that Mizo nationalism in many ways was something which was homegrown. So I totally get your point, and I think it is something that has been quite well documented to me, and it is also one reason why I did not go and discuss in length about what you call the intellectual source of Mizo nationalism in terms of their exposure to the wider world. Thank you so much.
Right. Any more questions, comments, queries? Yeah. Professor Swan, do you have any
I am fine.
questions
I am
left
fine,
left
Professor Jyoti.
out? You
Uh,
done?
yeah, I'm done. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? If there are none, thank you so much for this very, very illuminating talk on a fabulous book. And thank you for sharing it with us this afternoon. Thank you on behalf of the school, and I hand you over to Professor Swan again. Professor Swan.
Okay, thank you once again, Professor Jyoti, for chairing the book talks. And we'd also like to thank, on my personal behalf and on behalf of the Department of Political Science, our resource person, the author of this very important book, Dr. Roluahpuia, for having agreed to come and for his very erudite presentation today. I hope that this would refresh and illuminate the ways in which we understand nationalism from a very different vantage point. And our sincere thanks to the faculty of the department as well as of the school, and also to other participants, not only within the department and the schools, but also from outside the university. I would like to thank each and every one once again, and we hope to more interesting works from Pui. And since he has been a very prolific scholar, we hope that he should be coming out with more illuminating studies, not only on the Mizo case, but also in other related domains of his expertise. Thank you once again. And with this note, I'll thank the chair, Professor Jyoti, for this
Thank you.
time. And have a good day, all of you. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
everyone.
And
Thank you,
I'll
everyone.
stop the recording for now.
Thank you.